Imagine you're standing in the middle of nowhere, knee-deep in cattle manure that's been baking in the Texas sun for 3 days straight. Your horse just threw you into a patch of prickly pear cactus because a tumbleweed spooked him. Your last decent meal was a week ago, and what you're calling beef stew tonight is basically leather boiled in dirty water with some questionable mushrooms you found growing near the chuck wagon. Oh, and that romantic sunset you're watching, that's not romance. That's your sunburned retinas desperately trying to process light after 14 hours of squinting through dust so thick you could practically chew it. Welcome to the glamorous life of a cowboy, where the only thing more abundant than the cattle droppings is your regret for ever thinking this job sounded like an adventure. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight we're going to shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about cowboys. We're going to explore why being a cowboy wasn't a grand adventure of freedom and heroism, but rather one of the most miserable, dangerous and poorly paid jobs in American history. A job so awful that most people who tried it lasted less than a year before running back to whatever they'd been doing before they lost their minds and decided to become professional cattle herders. This is the story of what it really meant to be a cowboy in the Wild West. And trust me, by the end of this tale, you'll understand why Hollywood had to completely reinvent the cowboy just to make him seem remotely appealing. Your story begins not with a dramatic showdown at high noon, but with you waking up at 4 a.m. to the sound of your trail boss screaming that the cattle are scattered across 3 counties because someone forgot to properly secure the rope corral. Congratulations, you're about to spend the next 16 hours hunting down 2,000-pound animals that have the collective intelligence of a particularly dim rock and the temperament of a caffeinated toddler. But let's back up a bit, shall we? Because understanding why your life sucks requires understanding how you got here in the first place. The year is 1867, and you've just made what will go down as one of the worst career decisions in human history. The Civil War is over, leaving the country with a surplus of young men who know how to ride horses, shoot guns, and not much else. The Industrial Revolution is chugging along in the East, but out here in Texas, the economy runs on 4 legs and moves a lot. You're probably around 20 years old, though exact ages are fuzzy because record-keeping in post-war America was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. Maybe you're a former Confederate soldier looking for work. Maybe you're an immigrant who heard that America was the land of opportunity and interpreted opportunity very loosely. Or maybe you're just a farm boy who thought herding cattle sounded more exciting than plowing fields. Spoiler alert, it's not. The cattle industry in Texas is booming, but not in the way you might think. See, Texas is absolutely overflowing with cattle. During the war, while men were busy shooting each other in increasingly creative ways, the longhorn cattle were doing what cattle do best, making more cattle. By 1867, there are an estimated 5 million head of cattle wandering around Texas like bovine tumbleweeds. The problem? In Texas, these cattle are worth about $3 to $4 per head. In Kansas, $40. In New York, even more. It's basic economics, except the economics involve convincing thousands of stubborn, smelly animals to walk 800 miles through hostile territory without dying, getting lost, or trampling you into a paste. This is where you come in, you poor, naive soul. The job posting, if you could call the drunken rambling of a trail boss in a saloon a job posting, probably went something like this. Wanted, young men for exciting work with cattle, must be willing to travel, good pay, adventure guaranteed. What they didn't mention was that exciting meant constantly terrifying. Good pay was relative to the cost of dying of dysentery, and adventure was code for suffering in ways you didn't know were possible. But you signed up anyway, because you were young and stupid and probably a little hungry. The trail boss, a weathered man who looked like he'd been personally acquainted with every thorn bush between Texas and Kansas, shook your hand with a grip that could crush walnuts and welcomed you to the crew. "Hope you can ride," he said, eyeing your obviously store-bought boots with the kind of contempt usually reserved for people who put ketchup on steak. "Sure can," you lied, because at 20 years old, lying about your qualifications seemed like a reasonable life strategy. This was your first mistake. Your second mistake was believing that can ride meant the same thing to cowboys as it did to Sunday afternoon pleasure riders. When a cowboy says he can ride, he means he can stay on a horse that's actively trying to kill him, while that horse is running at full speed through a thunderstorm, while being chased by angry cattle, and possibly Native Americans who are understandably upset about the whole stealing their land situation. When you said you could ride, you meant you'd successfully completed a few lazy circles around your uncle's farm without falling off. Your first day on the job starts before dawn, because apparently cowboys have some kind of personal vendetta against sleep. You're awakened not by a gentle nudge or a cheerful good morning, but by someone throwing your boots at your head and informing you that if you're not on your horse in 5 minutes, you'll be walking to Kansas. Kansas, in case you're wondering, is about 800 miles away. You stumble out of your bedroll, which is basically a fancy name for a blanket on the ground that you share with scorpions, and discover that every muscle in your body has apparently died during the night. This is because yesterday was your first day of actual cowboy work, and your body is lodging a formal complaint with your brain about your recent life choices. Your horse, a cantankerous beast named something like Widowmaker, or Satan's Revenge, or possibly just Frank, eyes you with the kind of disdain usually reserved for people who talk during movies. Frank knows you're new. Frank knows you're inexperienced. Frank has decided that making your life miserable is going to be his primary source of entertainment for the foreseeable future. You approach Frank with what you hope is confidence but probably looks more like barely controlled panic. Frank, sensing your fear like a furry shark, immediately starts planning ways to deposit you in the nearest patch of cacti. The saddle, you discover, weighs approximately as much as a small building. Cowboys make saddling a horse look effortless, the way professional athletes make their sports look easy. In reality, wrestling a saddle onto a horse that doesn't want to be saddled is like trying to gift wrap an angry octopus. The moment you finally get everything situated and prepare to mount, Frank executes what can only be described as a tactical maneuver designed to send you flying into the nearest water trough. The other cowboys, those weathered men who've been doing this for years and have developed the emotional range of particularly stoic rocks, watch this performance with barely concealed amusement. They don't help, of course. Helping would deprive them of their morning entertainment, and entertainment is rare on the trail. Eventually, through a combination of stubbornness, luck, and what you choose to believe is natural talent, you manage to get on Frank's back and stay there. Frank, disappointed but not defeated, files this information away for future use. The trail boss, a man named something like Jeremiah Hardwick or Ezra Ironside, all trail bosses seem to have names that sound like they were carved from granite, rides up and surveys his crew, 25 men, roughly 2,500 head of cattle, and enough supplies to maybe last half the journey if everyone's very careful and very lucky. Boys, he announces in a voice like gravel in a coffee grinder, we got 800 miles of hell ahead of us. Cattle don't want to go, weather don't want to cooperate, and half of you look like you couldn't find your own arse with both hands and a detailed map. He pauses to spit tobacco juice into the dust with remarkable accuracy. But we're gonna get these beeves to Abilene, even if it kills us, which it might. This, you realize with growing horror, is not a pep talk. This is a statement of fact. The trail boss continues. Cookie's got the chuck wagon. Drag riders in the back, swing riders on the sides, point riders up front. Newbies get drag until they prove they won't get themselves or anyone else killed. Drag, you quickly learn, is not a position of honor. Drag riders ride at the back of the herd, eating dust kicked up by 2,500 cattle, and dealing with the stragglers, the injured, and the generally ornery beasts that can't keep up with the main group. It's like being the last pick in gym class, except instead of dodgeball, you're dealing with half-ton animals with anger management issues. Your position at the back of the herd also means you get the full aromatic experience of cattle on the move. If you've never smelled 2,500 cattle that have been walking for days in the heat, consider yourself blessed. It's not just the manure, though that's certainly a significant component. It's also the dust, the sweat, the general funk of animals that don't believe in personal hygiene, all mixed together into an olfactory assault that makes you question your life choices on a molecular level. The dust is particularly special. It's not just dirt. It's a carefully curated blend of soil, pulverized manure, and what you suspect might be the dreams of dead cowboys. It gets in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your ears. It gets places you didn't know dust could get. By the end of your first day, you look like you've been dipped in chocolate, if chocolate were made of dirt and regret. Your job, such as it is, involves keeping the slower cattle moving and preventing them from wandering off to explore whatever catches their bovine fancy. Cattle, you discover, have the attention span of goldfish and the survival instincts of particularly suicidal lemmings. A butterfly can distract them. A interesting-looking rock can stop them completely. A slight breeze can send them into a panic that spreads through the herd like wildfire. And when cattle panic, they stampede. A stampede is basically nature's way of demonstrating that 2,500 animals running in random directions can generate the approximate force of a small earthquake. The ground shakes, the air fills with dust, and the sound of hooves and terrified mooing. Cowboys shout instructions that you can't hear over the noise. Frank, your treacherous horse, decides this would be an excellent time to test your riding skills by performing what can only be described as an interpretive dance about why he doesn't want to be anywhere near the stampeding cattle. Your job during a stampede is theoretically to help guide the cattle back into some semblance of order. In practice, your job is to try not to die while more experienced cowboys do the actual work. This involves staying on your horse, staying out of the way, and trying not to add to the chaos by screaming, though the screaming part is more challenging than you might expect. The experienced cowboys handle stampedes with the kind of casual competence that makes it look easy. They ride alongside the panicked cattle, gradually turning the stampede into a large circle, letting the animals run themselves tired before slowly gathering them back into a manageable group. It's like magic, if magic involved a lot more dust and profanity. You, meanwhile, are just trying to figure out which direction is up, while Frank attempts to buck you off into the path of the stampede. Because Frank has a twisted sense of humor, eventually the stampede burns itself out. The cattle settle down, and everyone takes a moment to count heads and make sure nobody got trampled into the prairie. This is when you discover that 3 cattle are missing, probably wandering around somewhere enjoying their newfound freedom and laughing at the cowboys who have to track them down. Tracking lost cattle is exactly as fun as it sounds, which is to say it's not fun at all. It involves following tracks that all look identical to your untrained eye, searching through brush that seems specifically designed to tear clothes and skin, and hoping that the missing cattle haven't decided to join a passing buffalo herd or gotten themselves eaten by wolves. The experienced cowboys can read tracks like a book, spotting signs that tell them not just where the cattle went but how fast they were moving, how long ago they passed, and probably what they had for breakfast. You, on the other hand, can barely tell the difference between a cattle track and a particularly large dog print. That's a cattle track, the trail boss explains with the patience of a man who has had this conversation many times before. How can you tell, you ask, squinting at what looks like a random depression in the dirt. It's shaped like a cattle hoof. Oh. This level of tracking expertise is apparently something you develop over time, like the ability to sleep on the ground without waking up feeling like you've been beaten with hammers, or the skill of eating beans and hardtack for weeks without your digestive system staging a revolt. After several hours of searching, you finally locate the missing cattle. They're standing in a creek, apparently having decided that this is where they live now. Getting them out of the creek and back to the herd involves a lot of shouting, some creative uses of rope, and Frank's continued efforts to deposit you in the water. Cattle, it turns out, really like water when they find it, and really don't like leaving it once they're in it. They stand there looking at you with those big stupid eyes that somehow manage to convey both innocence and stubborn defiance, as if they're saying, "What? We're comfortable here. Why don't you go find some other cattle to bother?" Eventually, through a combination of persistence, rope work that would make a sailor weep with envy, and what you're pretty sure is cowboy magic, you manage to convince the cattle that rejoining the herd is in their best interest. They reluctantly leave their creek paradise and plod back toward the group, probably already planning their next escape attempt. By the time you return to the herd with the wayward cattle, the sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would be beautiful if you weren't too tired and sore to appreciate them. The chuck wagon has stopped for the night, and Cookie, the trail cook who rules his domain with an iron ladle and a vocabulary that could make a sailor blush, is already preparing what passes for dinner. Dinner on the trail is an experience in lowered expectations. Cookie does his best with what he has, but what he has is basically beans, hardtack, coffee, that could double as paint stripper, and whatever meat might be available. Sometimes there's fresh beef when a cow gets injured and has to be put down. Sometimes there's game if someone manages to shoot something edible. Most of the time there's beans. Beans and more beans. After a week on the trail, you start having dreams about vegetables, green vegetables, fresh bread, food that doesn't require soaking overnight to become edible. The hardtack, meanwhile, is basically edible concrete. It's designed to last forever, which it does by being so hard that bacteria can't penetrate it. Neither can human teeth in many cases. The standard procedure for eating hardtack involves soaking it in coffee until it reaches the approximate consistency of wet cardboard, then chewing it very carefully to avoid breaking a tooth. Cookie's coffee deserves special mention. It's not just strong, it's aggressive. It's the kind of coffee that could wake the dead, then give them the energy to dig their way out of their graves. After a few cups of Cookie's coffee, you understand why cowboys have a reputation for being tough. Anyone who can drink that coffee regularly and live to tell about it is clearly made of sterner stuff than ordinary mortals. The evening routine involves unsaddling your horse, which is almost as much of an adventure as saddling him was in the morning. Frank has spent the entire day plotting new ways to make your life difficult, and unsaddling time is when he puts these plans into action. He steps on your feet. He swings his head around to knock your hat off. He generally acts like a large furry toddler who's been told he can't have candy. After dealing with Frank's evening tantrum, you get to participate in the nightly ritual of setting up camp. This involves unrolling your bedroll, checking it for scorpions and spiders, and trying to find a spot that's not directly on top of a rock, a cactus, or a rattlesnake den. Sleep on the trail is more theoretical than actual. Your bedroll provides minimal cushioning between you and the ground, which seems to be composed entirely of rocks specifically shaped to dig into whatever part of your body is trying to rest. The night sounds of the prairie, coyotes howling, cattle lowing, the mysterious rustling that could be wind or could be something with teeth, keep you in a state of semi-alertness that makes real rest impossible. Cowboys take turns staying awake to watch the cattle, because cattle are apparently prone to wandering off in the dark like bovine sleepwalkers. Night watch involves riding slowly around the herd in the dark, singing or humming to keep the cattle calm. The theory is that human voices reassure the cattle and prevent stampedes. In practice, night watch is an exercise in staying awake while everything in your body screams for sleep. You ride Frank through the darkness, both of you half asleep, mumbling whatever songs you can remember from childhood. Your voice cracks from dust and exhaustion, and you're pretty sure your singing is more likely to frighten the cattle than soothe them. But you keep going because that's what cowboys do. Without the light pollution of cities, the sky is a vast canvas of twinkling lights that stretches from horizon to horizon. It's beautiful and humbling, and would be inspiring if you weren't so tired that you're having trouble staying in the saddle. Sometimes during night watch, you hear things, not just the normal sounds of the prairie, but other things. Sounds that might be Native American war parties, sounds that might be rustlers looking to steal cattle, sounds that might be wolves or mountain lions or other predators that view both you and the cattle as potential dinner. Most of the time, these sounds turn out to be nothing more threatening than a raccoon or a particularly large rabbit. But in the dark, with your imagination running wild and your nerves stretched thin, every sound becomes a potential threat. You find yourself jumping at shadows and spinning around to investigate noises that turn out to be tumbleweeds. 3 hours of fitful sleep on the hard ground, dreaming of soft beds and real food and wondering what possessed you to think this was a good idea. Morning comes too soon, announced not by an alarm clock but by the trail boss's voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a rusty knife through leather. Rise and shine, you lazy sons of prairie dogs. Them cattle ain't gonna drive themselves. You emerge from your bedroll feeling like you've been stomped on by the very cattle you're supposed to be driving. Your back aches from sleeping on the ground. Your legs are stiff from hours in the saddle. Your hands are raw from rope work. And you still have 799 miles to go. Frank greets you with his usual enthusiasm, which is to say he tries to step on your feet while you're saddling him. The other cowboys are already moving around camp with the efficient movements of men who have done this routine so many times it's become automatic. They saddle their horses, grab coffee and whatever Cookie has managed to scrape together for breakfast, and prepare for another day of convincing reluctant cattle to move in the right direction. Breakfast is usually beans and coffee, sometimes with a piece of salt pork if you're lucky. The coffee helps wake you up, assuming it doesn't kill you first. The beans provide the necessary fuel for another day of hard work, assuming your digestive system can handle them. After a few weeks of this diet, your body adapts in ways that are probably best not discussed in polite company. The daily routine quickly becomes second nature, not because it's easy, but because it's repetitive enough that even your sleep-deprived brain can handle it. Wake up before dawn, saddle your horse while trying not to get killed, drink coffee that could strip paint, eat beans that may or may not be actual food. Spend the next 14 hours keeping cattle moving in roughly the right direction while dealing with heat, dust, insects, and your horse's ongoing efforts to make you miserable. The Great Plains in summer are basically a giant oven with no air conditioning. The sun beats down mercilessly, turning the metal parts of your saddle into branding irons and making the air shimmer with heat waves. You sweat constantly, which would be fine if there were any way to replace the fluids you're losing, but water is strictly rationed on the trail. Water is more precious than gold out here. The success or failure of the entire drive often depends on finding reliable water sources for both the cattle and the men. A good water hole can save the day. A dry creek bed where you expected to find water can be a death sentence. When you do find water, it's not necessarily good water. Prairie water holes are often muddy, brackish, or shared with every animal in a 50-mile radius, but you drink it anyway because the alternative is dying of thirst. You learn to strain the water through your teeth to catch the worst of the mud and hope that whatever microscopic creatures are swimming around in there won't kill you too quickly. The cattle, of course, have no such qualms about water quality. They'll drink from any puddle, stream, or water hole they can find, often stirring up mud and debris in the process. Watching 2,500 cattle drink from a small water hole is like watching a natural disaster in slow motion. By the time they're finished, what was once a clear stream has become a muddy mess that barely qualifies as liquid. Getting the cattle away from water once they've found it is another challenge entirely. Cattle are smart enough to know that water is important, but not smart enough to understand the concept of rationing or schedule management. They want to stand in the water, lie down in the water, and generally treat every water source like a bovine spa resort. This leads to long delays while cowboys work to extract reluctant cattle from water holes, using a combination of shouting, rope work, and increasingly creative profanity. The cattle, meanwhile, look at you with those big innocent eyes that seem to say, "But we like it here, why are you being so mean?" During particularly hot days, the heat becomes a living thing that presses down on you like a giant invisible weight. The air shimmers with heat waves, making distant objects appear to dance and waver. The metal parts of your saddle become too hot to touch with bare skin. Your hat provides some protection from the sun, but it also traps heat around your head, creating a personal sauna that follows you everywhere. Dust storms are another delightful feature of prairie life. When the wind picks up, it doesn't just blow, it attacks. Dust fills the air until you can barely see your horse's ears, let alone the cattle you're supposed to be watching. The dust gets in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your ears. It gets inside your clothes and under your skin. It turns your sweat into mud and your coffee into gritty sludge. During a dust storm, the cattle become even more unpredictable than usual. They can't see where they're going any better than you can, so they tend to wander off in random directions or bunch up together in confused clusters. Keeping the herd together in a dust storm is like trying to herd cats while blindfolded and riding a bucking horse. The cowboys develop a system of whistles and shouts for communicating during dust storms. Since visual signals are useless when you can't see more than a few feet in any direction, you learn to recognize the sound of different whistles and what they mean. Turn the herd left. Watch for strays. Help, I'm lost and my horse is trying to kill me. When the dust finally settles, everyone looks like they've been dipped in chocolate. The cattle look like brown statues, the horses look like they're made of mud, and you look like you've been buried alive and recently dug up. But the dust storms are nothing compared to the real weather. Thunderstorms on the Great Plains are not the gentle spring showers you might remember from your childhood. They're meteorological monsters that roll across the prairie like angry gods, bringing lightning, hail, and winds that can knock a horse off its feet. The sky turns an ominous greenish-black color that makes even experienced cowboys start looking for shelter. Lightning on the open prairie is particularly terrifying because there's nowhere to hide. You're the tallest object for miles around, sitting on a horse and wearing metal spurs and belt buckles that make you a natural lightning rod. The smart thing to do is get off your horse and lie flat on the ground, but that means abandoning the cattle, which means losing your job and possibly your life when the trail boss finds out. So you stay in the saddle, trying to keep the increasingly panicked cattle together while lightning crashes around you like an artillery barrage. The cattle, sensing the approaching storm, become even more skittish than usual. They mill around nervously, their eyes rolling white with fear, ready to bolt at the first thunderclap. And when the thunder does come, it's not a gentle rumble, it's a sound like the world splitting in half. The cattle, already on edge, explode into motion like a dam bursting. 2,500 cattle running in blind panic, with you and your fellow cowboys trying to stay out of their way while somehow maintaining control. Hail is another special treat that prairie storms like to throw at you. Not little pellets of ice, but chunks the size of chicken eggs that fall from the sky like frozen artillery shells. They bounce off your hat, bruise your shoulders, and spook the cattle even more than the thunder. The horses hate hail almost as much as the cowboys do, adding their own panic to an already chaotic situation. Rain, when it comes, is not the gentle precipitation that farmers pray for. It's a torrential downpour that turns the prairie into a muddy swamp within minutes. The dust that's been your constant companion suddenly becomes mud that sticks to everything and makes every step a struggle. Your clothes become heavy and waterlogged. Your saddle becomes slippery. The cattle become even more miserable than usual, if such a thing is possible. But the worst part about prairie rainstorms is that they can turn a dry creek bed into a raging river in the space of an hour. What was a dusty depression in the morning can become a deadly torrent by afternoon, complete with debris, dead trees, and currents strong enough to sweep away horse and rider. River crossings are among the most dangerous parts of any cattle drive, and they become even more perilous when the rivers are swollen with storm runoff. The cattle, who are already suspicious of water deeper than their ankles, become absolutely terrified of fast-moving water. Getting 2,500 reluctant cattle across a river in flood is like trying to convince 2,500 toddlers to jump off a cliff. The process usually involves getting a few brave cattle into the water first, hoping the others will follow. Sometimes this works. Sometimes the lead cattle get swept downstream, panic, and swim back to the starting side, convincing the rest of the herd that crossing the river is definitely a bad idea. When cattle do get caught in fast water, they often panic and start swimming in circles or against the current. Cowboys have to ride into the water to help guide them to safety, which means risking both horse and rider to save animals that will probably do something equally stupid tomorrow. You learn to read water the way you learn to read cattle tracks, looking for signs of depth, current speed, and underwater obstacles. A river that looks calm on the surface might have a vicious undertow. A shallow-looking crossing might hide quicksand or hidden logs that can trap a horse's legs. Your first major river crossing is a baptism by fire that makes everything else you've experienced seem easy by comparison. The river is running high from recent rains, brown with mud and debris. The current is fast enough that you can see logs and branches racing downstream like nature's way of showing off its power. The trail boss surveys the water with the expression of a man trying to decide between two equally unpleasant ways to die. "Well, boys," he says finally, "it ain't gonna get any prettier. Let's get these beeves across before it gets dark." The experienced cowboys start working the cattle toward the water's edge, using a combination of shouting, rope work, and what you're becoming convinced is actual magic. The cattle, sensing what's about to happen, become increasingly reluctant to approach the river. They bunch up, mill around, and generally act like they're being asked to volunteer for a suicide mission. Finally, after much effort and more creative profanity than you thought existed in the English language, a few cattle are convinced to enter the water. They wade in reluctantly, testing each step and looking back at their companions with expressions that clearly say, "This is a terrible idea, but apparently we're doing it anyway." The first few cattle make it across safely, and for a moment it looks like the crossing might go smoothly. Then one of the cattle in the middle of the stream gets caught by the current, panics and starts swimming in the wrong direction. This sets off a chain reaction of panic that spreads through the herd like wildfire. Suddenly, cattle are scattered across the river, some swimming downstream, some trying to turn back, some just standing in the water and bawling like the world is ending. Cowboys ride into the current, shouting instructions that can't be heard over the noise of rushing water and panicked cattle. Frank, your ever-helpful horse, chooses this moment to demonstrate his strong feelings about river crossings by attempting to buck you off into the current. You manage to stay in the saddle, but just barely, and Frank makes it clear that he considers this whole enterprise a personal insult. The next 2 hours are a chaos of water, mud, and increasingly desperate attempts to get scattered cattle back together and pointed in the right direction. You get soaked to the skin, nearly trampled by a panicked steer, and at one point find yourself standing waist-deep in rushing water, trying to untangle a cow from a tree branch, while Frank stands on the bank, looking at you with what you swear is amusement. Eventually, through a combination of skill, luck, and what might charitably be called divine intervention, most of the cattle make it across the river. A few are swept downstream and have to be retrieved miles away. One gets its hoof caught between two rocks and has to be pulled free, and one particularly obstinate bull decides that the middle of the river is where he lives now, and has to be convinced otherwise through methods that involve a lot of rope and even more profanity. By the time the last cow is safely across, you're exhausted, soaked, muddy, and have a new appreciation for dry ground. But there's no time to rest because the herd needs to be moved away from the river before nightfall, and there's still the chuck wagon to get across. Getting the chuck wagon across a swollen river is an adventure that makes herding cattle look easy. The wagon is heavy, unwieldy, and contains all the supplies that keep the crew alive. Cookie, the trail cook, protects his wagon with the fierce dedication of a mother protecting her cubs, which means he's very vocal about how everyone else is handling the crossing. "Easy there, you ham-fisted idiots," Cookie shouts as the cowboys maneuver ropes and pulleys to get the wagon safely across. "That there's my Dutch oven you're bouncing around like a kid's toy. I got beans soaking in there." The thought of losing Cookie's beans, which constitute about 80% of your diet, adds urgency to the wagon crossing. The cowboys work carefully, using multiple ropes and a complex system of pulleys to guide the wagon across the current. The wagon sways and tilts alarmingly, and at one point you're sure it's going to tip over and dump all your supplies into the river. But Cookie's wagon makes it across intact, beans and all, and the crew can finally start thinking about making camp for the night. Except making camp after a river crossing involves finding a place that's not muddy, not likely to flood if it rains again, and not occupied by anything with teeth. Your clothes, which were already not exactly fresh, are now soaked through with river water that may or may not contain things you don't want to think about. There's no dry wood for a fire, so dinner is cold beans and hardtack. Your bedroll is damp, your boots are full of water, and Frank is giving you looks that suggest he's planning elaborate revenge for the indignity of the river crossing. But you survived your first major river crossing, which makes you slightly less of a greenhorn in the eyes of the other cowboys. They don't exactly welcome you into their brotherhood, but they stop treating you like you're likely to die at any moment, which you suppose is progress. The next morning brings new challenges, because the trail never stops providing new ways to make your life miserable. The cattle, having survived their own ordeal at the river, are now scattered across several square miles of prairie and need to be gathered back into a manageable herd. Some of them apparently decided during the night that they liked the other side of the river better and wandered back across. Others have simply disappeared into the landscape like bovine ghosts. Gathering scattered cattle is like playing the world's least fun game of hide and seek, where the players weigh half a ton each and have no interest in being found. You and the other cowboys spread out across the prairie, following tracks, looking for movement, and hoping that the missing cattle haven't joined a buffalo herd or gotten themselves eaten by wolves. The experienced cowboys make this look easy, reading the landscape like a book and somehow knowing exactly where to look for strays. They can tell from a bent blade of grass which direction a cow went and how long ago. They can spot a black cow against a dark background from half a mile away. You, meanwhile, could probably miss a bright white cow standing directly in front of you if it held perfectly still. "There," says one of the older cowboys, pointing at what looks to you like empty prairie. 2 cows, maybe 3, headed toward them rocks. You squint in the direction he's pointing and see nothing but grass, rocks, and more grass. Either the cowboy has supernatural vision, or you're going blind from all the dust and sun. Given your recent experiences, blindness seems like the more likely explanation. After 20 minutes of searching, you finally spot what the experienced cowboy saw immediately. 3 cows standing in the shade of some rocks, chewing their cud and looking supremely unbothered by the fact that they've caused a massive search operation. They watch your approach with the kind of mild interest usually reserved for watching paint dry. Getting the strays back to the main herd involves more of the same rope work, shouting, and strategic positioning that you're slowly learning constitutes about 90% of cowboy work. The cows don't want to leave their shady spot. They've found a nice place with some decent grass and see no reason why they should abandon it to rejoin a bunch of other cows walking through the hot sun toward an uncertain destination. Frank, meanwhile, has developed what you're beginning to recognize as his cow work attitude, which involves a lot of snorting, head tossing, and general indication that he considers cattle to be beneath his dignity. Frank apparently believes he's a warhorse trapped in the body of a cow pony, forced to associate with livestock when he should be charging into battle with his mane flowing dramatically in the wind. The reality is that Frank is a short, stocky horse with the temperament of a particularly moody teenager and the attention span of a goldfish. But he's your horse, and after several weeks on the trail, you've developed the kind of relationship that comes from mutual dependence and shared misery. Frank tolerates you because you feed him and scratch behind his ears. You tolerate Frank because the alternative is walking 800 miles to Kansas. Once the strays are collected and the herd is back together, the day settles into its familiar rhythm of dust, heat, and the constant challenge of keeping 2,500 animals moving in roughly the same direction. The cattle have developed their own hierarchy and social groups during the drive, which makes them slightly more manageable, but also more complicated. Some cattle are natural leaders who will follow the trail without much encouragement. Others are followers who will go wherever the leaders go, assuming they notice where the leaders are going. And then there are the troublemakers, the cows and steers who seem to view the entire enterprise as a personal challenge to their independence. You learn to recognize the troublemakers quickly. There's the big red steer who likes to break away from the herd and try to convince others to follow him on unauthorized detours. There's the black cow who has apparently appointed herself the herd's scout and insists on investigating every interesting rock, bush, or patch of grass along the way. And there's the spotted bull who seems to have a personal vendetta against cowboys and will charge at any rider who gets too close. Dealing with these problem cattle becomes a daily routine that requires strategy, patience, and a working knowledge of bovine psychology. The red steer, for example, can usually be discouraged from his escape attempts by positioning a rider on his favorite side and making it clear that any deviation from the trail will result in immediate and unpleasant consequences. The black cow responds better to gentle guidance, probably because she's actually trying to be helpful in her own confused way. A little pressure from the right angle will usually convince her to rejoin the herd without too much drama. The spotted bull, however, requires more creative management. He's big enough and angry enough to be genuinely dangerous, so dealing with him involves a lot of careful positioning, quick movements, and the occasional strategic retreat. Frank, despite his general attitude problems, has developed a healthy respect for the spotted bull and makes sure to stay well out of charging range. Cattle form friendships, rivalries, and complex relationships that affect how they behave on the trail. Some cows will only move if their best friend is with them. Others will refuse to cross water if a cow they don't like has already crossed. Understanding these relationships and using them to manage the herd becomes part of the cowboy's skill set. you start to recognize individual animals, not just by their appearance, but by their personalities and quirks. There's the brown cow, who always walks at the edge of the herd because she doesn't like crowds. There's the young steer who gets distracted by everything and constantly wanders off to investigate interesting smells. There's the old bull, who's clearly the herd's patriarch, and whose mood affects the behavior of every other animal within a quarter-mile radius. This personal knowledge of the cattle makes your job easier in some ways, but also more emotionally complicated. It's hard to maintain professional detachment from animals you've been working with for weeks, even when those animals are destined for the slaughterhouses of Kansas. You find yourself developing favorites among the herd, cattle whose personalities or behaviors you find endearing or amusing. There's one particular cow, a black and white spotted heifer you've mentally named Patches, who seems to have adopted you as her personal cowboy. Patches always positions herself near whatever part of the herd you're working, and she responds to your voice in a way that makes you think she actually recognizes you as an individual, rather than just another source of pressure and annoyance. This emotional attachment to the cattle creates an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance that you try not to think about too much. These animals trust you to guide them safely to their destination, but their destination is ultimately death. It's a reality of the job that experienced cowboys have learned to compartmentalize, but as a newcomer, you haven't yet developed that emotional armor. The trail boss, who has been watching your development as a cowboy with the kind of attention a teacher pays to a particularly slow student, occasionally offers advice that goes beyond the purely practical aspects of cattle handling. Don't get too attached, he tells you one evening as you're both watching the herd settle for the night. They're beef on legs, son. Start thinking of them as pets and this job will eat you alive. It's practical advice delivered with the kind of gruff kindness that passes for compassion among men who spend their lives dealing with death and hardship. But following that advice is easier said than done when you're spending 14 hours a day with animals that have distinct personalities and individual quirks. The emotional complexity of the job is just one more layer of difficulty added to what's already a physically and mentally demanding profession. Cowboys not only have to be skilled riders, competent rope handlers, and amateur veterinarians, they also have to be tough enough emotionally to maintain professional distance from animals they work closely with for months at a time. This emotional toughness extends to relationships with fellow cowboys as well. The trail crew becomes a tight-knit group out of necessity, but it's a brotherhood forged by shared hardship rather than natural affection. You depend on these men for your safety and survival, and they depend on you, but that doesn't mean you necessarily like each other. Some of your fellow cowboys are decent men doing a difficult job as best they can. Others are drifters, outlaws, or just hard cases who couldn't make it in more civilized professions. The trail attracts men who don't fit well into normal society, and some of them don't fit well for very good reasons. There's Jake, a former Confederate soldier who drinks too much and has violent mood swings that make everyone nervous. There's Slim, a gambler who's constantly trying to organize card games and betting pools, usually involving things like which cow will wander off next, or whether Cookie will actually succeed in poisoning someone with his cooking. There's Mexican Pete, who's the best rider in the crew, and can do things with a rope that seem to defy the laws of physics, but who doesn't speak much English and keeps to himself. And there's old Tom, who's been driving cattle since before the war, and has an endless supply of stories about the good old days when everything was tougher, more dangerous, and somehow better than it is now. The dynamics between these men shift constantly based on circumstances, fatigue, and the various personality conflicts that develop when people are forced to live and work together in difficult conditions. Arguments break out over everything from who's responsible for a particular chore to whether it's going to rain tomorrow. Most of these arguments are settled quickly, either through compromise or through the intervention of the trail boss, who maintains order with a combination of authority, experience, and the implicit threat of violence. But sometimes tensions build to the point where they explode into actual fights. A fist fight between cowboys is a carefully choreographed affair that follows unwritten rules developed over years of frontier justice. There's usually a brief period of escalating insults and posturing, followed by someone throwing the first punch, followed by a flurry of violence that ends when one man goes down or the trail boss intervenes. The fight itself is less important than what happens afterward. The men involved are expected to shake hands, put the conflict behind them, and get back to work. Holding grudges is a luxury the trail can't afford. and men who can't let go of their anger quickly find themselves walking back to Texas. You witness your first trail fight about 3 weeks into the drive, when Jake and Slim get into a dispute over a poker debt that escalates into accusations of cheating and finally into violence. It starts with Jake grabbing Slim by the shirt front and ends with both men rolling around in the dirt, throwing punches and creative insults with equal enthusiasm. The other cowboys form a loose circle around the combatants, not to break up the fight but to make sure it stays fair and doesn't get out of hand. This is apparently considered entertainment on the trail, where diversions are few and far between. The fight ends when Jake lands a solid punch that drops Slim into the dirt. Slim lies there for a moment testing various parts of his anatomy to make sure everything still works, then gets to his feet and extends his hand to Jake. "Good fight," Slim says, blood trickling from his nose. "I reckon that settles it." "Fright hand." Jake shakes the offered hand and nods. "Reckon it does. You ain't such a bad scrapper for a gambling man." And just like that, the conflict is over. The next day, Jake and Slim are working together like nothing happened, because on the trail, yesterday's enemy might be tomorrow's only hope for survival. This pragmatic approach to conflict resolution extends to most aspects of trail life. There's no room for long-term feuds, elaborate revenge schemes, or extended sulking. Problems need to be solved quickly and definitively, so the crew can get back to the business of moving cattle. You learn to navigate these interpersonal dynamics carefully, trying to stay on good terms with everyone, while avoiding getting drawn into conflicts that don't concern you. It's a delicate balance that requires constant attention to the mood and temperament of your fellow cowboys. The isolation of the trail intensifies all of these relationships, both positive and negative. There's nowhere to go to get away from someone you don't like. No privacy, no escape from the constant proximity of the same group of men. Small annoyances become major irritations. Minor personality quirks become unbearable character flaws. Old Tom's habit of spitting tobacco juice becomes a source of constant disgust when you're forced to watch it every day for weeks. Slim's tendency to hum the same 3 songs over and over starts to feel like deliberate torture. Jake's mood swings create an atmosphere of tension that affects the entire crew, but the same intensity that magnifies conflicts also strengthens bonds. When Mexican Pete pulls you out of the path of a charging steer, risking his own safety to save yours, the gratitude you feel is deeper than any you've experienced in civilian life. When Cookie shares his private stash of coffee with you during a particularly difficult day, it feels like an act of profound generosity. These relationships, forged in hardship and tested by danger, become some of the strongest you'll ever experience. The men who ride with you on the trail understand aspects of your character that your own family never saw, because they've seen how you behave when you're pushed to your physical and emotional limits. The trail reveals character in ways that normal life never could. It strips away the comfortable illusions and social pretenses that allow people to hide their true nature. Under the stress of constant danger, physical hardship, and emotional isolation, men show who they really are. Some men rise to the challenge, revealing reserves of courage, competence, and compassion that even they didn't know they possessed. Others crumble under the pressure, showing themselves to be weak, selfish, or cowardly when tested by real adversity. You discover things about yourself that you never would have learned in the safety and comfort of civilization. You learn that you can endure physical discomfort that once would have seemed unbearable. You learn that you can make life and death decisions quickly and live with the consequences. You learn that you can function effectively even when you're exhausted, hungry, and afraid. But you also learn uncomfortable truths about your own limitations. You discover that your courage has boundaries, that your endurance has limits, that your judgment can fail under pressure. These revelations are humbling in ways that force you to reevaluate your understanding of yourself and your place in the world. The trail becomes a crucible that burns away illusions and leaves behind something harder, more practical, but also more honest. The man who emerges from a successful cattle drive is fundamentally different from the one who started the journey, shaped by experiences that can't be replicated in any other environment. As the weeks pass and the miles accumulate, you begin to understand why men become addicted to this life despite its hardships. There's something about the simplicity of the trail, the clear objectives, the direct challenges, the immediate consequences that makes the complexity of civilized life seem artificial and unsatisfying. Keep the cattle moving, find water, avoid getting killed. Success and failure are measured in practical terms that anyone can understand. There's no politics, no social climbing, no elaborate games of status and influence, just you, your horse, your rope, and the endless challenge of moving stubborn animals across hostile country. This simplicity is seductive, especially for men who have struggled to find their place in a rapidly changing world. The trail offers a kind of purity that's increasingly rare in modern society, a life where a man's worth is measured by his skills, his courage, and his ability to work with others toward a common goal. But the seduction of trail life comes with a price that becomes more apparent as the drive continues. The same isolation that creates intense bonds between cowboys also cuts them off from the broader human community. The same simplicity that makes problems manageable also limits opportunities for growth and change. Trail life is fundamentally nomadic, rootless, and temporary. Cowboys drift from drive to drive, ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to build lasting relationships or create stable communities. It's a life that suits young men seeking adventure, but it becomes increasingly hollow as those men age and begin to want something more than constant movement and eternal challenge. You see this hollowness in the older cowboys, men like old Tom who have spent decades on various trails and now find themselves with nothing to show for it but memories and scars. They're competent, experienced, and respected within their narrow world, but they're also rootless and alone in ways that become more painful with each passing year. The trail boss himself embodies this contradiction. He's a man of obvious competence and natural authority, someone who can make life and death decisions with confidence and lead men through situations that would break lesser individuals. But he's also a man in his 50s with no family, no permanent home, and no prospects beyond the next cattle drive. Lochsporter. This ain't a life for an old man. He admits to you one evening when the whiskey has made him more philosophical than usual. But it's the only life I know, and I'm too set in my ways to learn another. It's a moment of vulnerability that reveals the loneliness that lurks beneath the competent exterior. For all his skills and experience, the trail boss is ultimately just another drifter, trapped by his own expertise in a profession that offers adventure and freedom at the cost of stability and community. Sith's realization casts a shadow over your own enthusiasm for trail life. The challenges and hardships that once seemed like temporary obstacles to be overcome begin to look more like permanent features of a lifestyle that has no real future. The trail offers escape from the constraints of civilized society, but it doesn't offer an alternative that leads anywhere meaningful. As you pass the halfway point of the drive, these philosophical concerns begin to compete with more immediate practical problems. The cattle are showing signs of the stress and exhaustion that come from weeks of constant travel. Some animals are losing weight despite the decent grazing you've been finding. Others are developing foot problems from walking on rocky ground. A few are showing signs of illness that could spread through the herd if not managed carefully. Managing sick cattle adds another layer of complexity to an already difficult job. Sick animals can't keep up with the herd, but they can't be left behind either, because that would mean financial loss for the trail boss and the investors who finance the drive. The solution usually involves extra attention from the cowboys, modified travel schedules, and a lot of hope that the animals will recover before they become too much of a burden. You learn the basics of cowboy veterinary medicine, which consists mostly of common sense, folk remedies, and desperate improvisation. A cow with a cut gets the wound cleaned and bandaged with whatever clean cloth is available. A steer with a stomach ailment gets a dose of whatever patent medicine Cookie might have in his supplies. An animal with a serious injury gets put out of its misery and becomes that night's dinner. The casual acceptance of animal suffering that's inherent in trail life is another aspect of the job that takes time to get used to. Cattle are valuable property, and reasonable efforts are made to keep them healthy and comfortable, but they're not pets or companions. When an animal becomes too sick or injured to continue, it's killed quickly and efficiently without sentiment or ceremony. This pragmatic approach to animal welfare extends to the horses as well. A horse that goes lame might be rested for a few days if the injury seems minor, but a horse with a serious problem gets shot and replaced if possible. Cowboys develop emotional attachments to their horses out of necessity, but they also understand that sentiment can't override practical considerations when survival is at stake. Frank, your cantankerous but reliable mount, develops a minor limp about 2/3 of the way through the drive. It's not serious enough to sideline him completely, but it's noticeable enough to worry you. The thought of losing Frank, despite his personality problems and ongoing efforts to make your life difficult, is genuinely distressing. You've spent so much time with Frank that you've learnt to read his moods and anticipate his reactions. You know that he doesn't like being saddled in the morning, but settles down once he gets moving. You know that he's afraid of snakes but will charge a stampeding bull without hesitation. You know that he prefers to drink from running water rather than still pools, and that he gets cranky if he doesn't get his ears scratched at least once a day. These intimate details of Frank's personality make him feel more like a partner than a tool, which makes the possibility of losing him to injury both emotionally painful and practically terrifying. A cowboy without a horse is like a sailor without a ship. Technically possible, but fundamentally helpless. Fortunately, Frank's limp turns out to be minor, caused by a small stone lodged in his hoof rather than any serious injury. Removing the stone and giving him a day of light duty solves the problem, but the incident serves as a reminder of how precarious your situation really is. Everything on the trail depends on everything else working properly. Your ability to do your job depends on Frank's soundness. Frank's health depends on finding adequate forage and water. Finding forage and water depends on the weather and the route chosen by the trail boss. The route depends on avoiding various hazards from flooded rivers to hostile Native American tribes to simple geographic obstacles. Any link in this chain can break at any time, and when it does, the consequences cascade through the entire operation. A lame horse can put a cowboy out of action. A sick cowboy can leave the crew short-handed at a critical moment. A shortage of cowboys can lead to lost cattle, which leads to financial loss, which can lead to the failure of the entire drive. The trail boss spends most of his time trying to anticipate and prevent these cascading failures, but there's only so much that planning and preparation can accomplish. Weather can't be controlled. Animals can't be made immune to disease and injury. Men can't be prevented from making mistakes or having accidents. The successful completion of a cattle drive depends as much on luck as on skill, and everyone involved knows it. This knowledge creates an undercurrent of anxiety that never quite goes away, even during the relatively peaceful stretches when everything seems to be going well. You learn to recognize the signs of this anxiety in your fellow cowboys. The way old Tom checks and rechecks his equipment every morning, looking for problems that might not exist. The way Mexican Pete constantly scans the horizon, watching for threats that may never materialize. The way the trail boss studies maps and weather signs with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. This constant vigilance is exhausting in its own way, adding mental fatigue to the physical exhaustion that comes from long days in the saddle. You find yourself jumping at unexpected sounds, startling when Frank stumbles slightly, worrying about problems that may never occur. The stress manifests differently in different men. Some become increasingly quiet and withdrawn, conserving their energy for the challenges they know are coming. Others become more talkative, using conversation as a way to manage their anxiety. A few become irritable and short-tempered, snapping at minor annoyances that they would normally ignore. Cookie deals with stress by becoming even more protective of his supplies and equipment, treating his chuck wagon like a fortress under siege. He counts and recounts his stores of flour, beans and coffee, calculating and recalculating how long they'll last at current consumption rates. "We're going to be eating our belts before we reach Abilene," Cookie mutters as he surveys his dwindling supplies. "Assuming we can find something to wash them down with that ain't horse piss." Cookie's pessimism about food supplies is both realistic and terrifying. Running out of food on the trail isn't just an inconvenience, it's a potential death sentence. There are no restaurants or grocery stores on the Great Plains, no friendly neighbors who might spare a cup of sugar or a loaf of bread. When trail supplies run low, the options are limited and unappealing. You can try to hunt game, but game animals are often scarce and always unpredictable. You can try to forage for edible plants, but most cowboys have only rudimentary knowledge of what's safe to eat and what might kill you. You can try to buy supplies from other travelers, but other travelers are rare, and they're usually dealing with their own supply problems. You can try to reach a settlement where supplies might be available, but that often means detouring from the planned route and losing valuable time. Or you can reduce rations and hope that whatever food remains will last until you reach your destination. This is usually the most practical option, but it means accepting a gradual decline in the crew's physical condition and morale as hunger becomes a constant companion. The prospect of going hungry adds another layer of misery to an already difficult situation. It's hard enough to do physical labor when you're well fed and rested. Doing that same work on reduced rations while fighting fatigue and the psychological effects of hunger pushes men to their breaking point and sometimes beyond. Hunger affects judgment, reflexes, and decision-making ability in ways that can be fatal in dangerous situations. A hungry cowboy is more likely to make mistakes that could result in injury or death. A hungry crew is more likely to have conflicts and arguments that undermine their ability to work together effectively. The trail boss is acutely aware of these dangers, which is why he spends so much time calculating food consumption and planning resupply strategies. But there's only so much that planning can accomplish when you're traveling through largely uninhabited country with limited transportation options. As the drive enters its final third, these supply concerns become increasingly acute. Cookie stores are definitely running low, and hunting has been poor for the past week. The crew is already on reduced rations, and further reductions seem inevitable unless something changes. Morale, which has been gradually declining as the cumulative effects of hardship take their toll, takes another hit when Cookie announces that coffee will be rationed starting immediately. Half a cup in the morning, half a cup at night, Cookie declares with the authority of a military commander. And don't even think about asking for more, because there ain't no more to give. The reaction to this announcement is immediate and visceral. Coffee isn't just a beverage on the trail, it's medicine, motivation, and comfort all rolled into one bitter, life-sustaining package. The thought of facing the challenges ahead with even less coffee than usual feels like a cruel joke. Hell, mutters Slim, might as well just shoot us now and get it over with. The comment is meant as humor, but it reflects a genuine despair that's becoming more apparent as the drive continues. The men are tired, hungry, and beginning to doubt whether the effort and suffering will ultimately be worth the promised payoff. The initial enthusiasm and sense of adventure gradually give way to grinding routine, which gives way to mounting hardship, which gives way to the question that haunts every cowboy's thoughts. Why am I doing this to myself? For some men, the answer is simple necessity. They need the money, and this is the only way they know to earn it. For others, it's a matter of pride or stubbornness. They started the job, and they're going to finish it regardless of the cost. But for many cowboys, especially those experiencing their first drive, the question becomes increasingly difficult to answer as the hardships mount. The romantic notions of adventure and freedom that might have motivated their initial decision are quickly burned away by the reality of constant discomfort, danger, and drudgery. You find yourself wrestling with this question during the long, monotonous hours in the saddle. The pay, when you finally receive it, will be decent but not extraordinary. The experience has certainly been educational, but not in ways that seem particularly valuable for future employment. The sense of accomplishment will be real, but it's hard to imagine that feeling being worth weeks of suffering. Yet something keeps you going, something beyond simple stubbornness or financial necessity. Perhaps it's the bonds you formed with your fellow cowboys, men who depend on you just as you depend on them. Perhaps it's a sense of obligation to the cattle themselves, animals who rely on your competence and dedication for their survival, however temporary. Or perhaps it's simply the knowledge that quitting isn't really an option. You're hundreds of miles from anywhere civilized, with no realistic way to get home except to see the drive through to completion. The trail boss might take pity on a man who was genuinely unable to continue due to illness or injury, but he'd have no sympathy for someone who simply decided the job was too hard. The trail has its own momentum that carries men forward even when their personal motivation falters. The daily routine of work becomes so automatic that it continues even when the conscious mind rebels against it. The horse gets saddled, the cattle get moved, the camp gets made, not because anyone particularly wants to do these things, but because they've become habits that require more energy to break than to continue. It keeps the drive moving when individual motivation fails, but it also traps men in situations they've grown to hate. The very qualities that make a man a good cowboy, persistence, endurance, loyalty to the crew, also make it difficult for him to abandon the trail, even when every fiber of his being wants to quit. As the drive enters Kansas, still weeks away from its final destination, these psychological pressures reach their peak. The cattle are showing signs of the same fatigue and stress that affects the men. The country is becoming more settled, which brings its own complications in the form of farmers who don't want cattle trampling their crops, and local officials who want to impose quarantine restrictions. The relationship between cattle drivers and farmers is one of mutual hostility based on legitimate but irreconcilable interests. Farmers want to protect their investments in crops and improvements. Cowboys need to move cattle through the most direct and practical routes. When these interests conflict, the results are often ugly. You encounter your first serious conflict with farmers about 50 miles into Kansas, when the trail crosses a valley where several families have established homesteads. The farmers have planted crops and built fences, creating obstacles that make the traditional trail route difficult or impossible to follow. The trail boss tries to negotiate a peaceful passage, offering to pay for any damage the cattle might cause, and promising to keep the herd moving as quickly as possible. But the farmers are having none of it. "We didn't break our backs clearing this land just to have a bunch of Texas Longhorns tear it up," declares the apparent spokesman for the group, a grim-faced man with the calloused hands of someone who's wrestled with the prairie and won. Find another way around. The problem is that there is no practical way around. The valley is the only reasonable route through this section of the country. Detouring would add days to the journey and might lead the herd into even more difficult terrain. The trail boss explains this patiently, but the farmers remain unmoved. They've worked too hard for what they have to risk losing it to accommodate a bunch of cowboys who, in their view, contribute nothing to the development of the country. The standoff continues for hours, with both sides becoming increasingly frustrated and angry. The cattle, sensing the tension, become restless and harder to control. The cowboys grip their weapons more tightly. The farmers gather more men and make vague threats about what might happen if the herd doesn't turn around. Finally, the trail boss makes a decision that reflects the pragmatic brutality of frontier life. "Boys," he says quietly to his crew, "we're going through. These sodbusters want to play hardball. We'll show them what hardball looks like." Risauchamal, what follows is not exactly a battle, but it's not exactly peaceful either. The cowboys push the herd forward, while the farmers try to turn them back. There's shouting, shoving, and a few punches thrown, but no guns are drawn, and no one gets seriously hurt. The cattle, confused and frightened by the commotion, spread out across the valley, trampling crops and generally creating the exact chaos the farmers had feared. By the time order is restored and the herd is gathered back together, significant damage has been done to several homesteads. The trail boss leaves money to pay for the damage, probably more than the crops were actually worth, but the gesture does little to ease the bitterness of the confrontation. The farmers watch the herd disappear over the horizon with expressions of pure hatred, and you suspect this won't be the last time cattle and agriculture come into conflict in this rapidly changing country. The incident leaves everyone shaken and angry. The cowboys are angry at being forced into a confrontation they didn't want. The farmers are angry at having their livelihoods threatened by men they see as lawless drifters. And you're angry at being caught in the middle of a conflict that seems to represent everything wrong with the way the West is being settled. But there's no time to dwell on these larger questions, because the immediate challenges of the trail continue to demand attention. The herd needs to be managed, the route needs to be planned, and the daily work of survival needs to continue regardless of philosophical concerns about progress and civilization. As you ride away from the trampled farms, you can't help but think about the fundamental conflict between the nomadic life of the cowboy and the settled life of the farmer. Both groups are trying to make a living from the same land, but their methods are incompatible. The cowboy needs mobility in open range. The farmer needs stability in enclosed fields. This conflict is being played out across the entire frontier as the country transitions from open range to settled agriculture. The cattle drives that seem so important now are really just a temporary phase in the development of the West, a brief period when it's still possible to move large herds across open country. But that period is ending, and everyone knows it. The farmers you just confronted are the future. The fences they build and the crops they plant represent a more stable and ultimately more profitable use of the land than cattle driving. The cowboys, for all their skills and traditions, are essentially anachronisms. men whose way of life is being made obsolete by progress. The very success of the cattle drives is contributing to their own destruction by opening up the country to settlement and development. This realization adds a note of melancholy to the final weeks of the drive. You're not just completing a job, you're participating in the end of an era. The skills you've learned and the experiences you've gained may have little value in the world that's rapidly taking shape around you. The trail towns that spring up to serve the cattle trade are themselves temporary, boom and bust communities that exist only as long as the drives continue. Once the railroads reach the source of the cattle and the open range is fenced and settled, these towns will either adapt to new economic realities or disappear entirely. Abilene, your final destination, is exactly this kind of place. A raw, violent, temporary community that exists solely to facilitate the transfer of cattle from trail drivers to railroad cars. It's a place where cowboys can finally spend the money they've earned, but it's also a place that epitomizes everything brutal and temporary about frontier life. When you finally see Abilene on the horizon after weeks of anticipation, your first reaction is not relief or excitement, but a kind of hollow disappointment. The town looks exactly like what it is, a collection of hastily built structures designed to separate cowboys from their money as quickly and efficiently as possible. There are stockyards, of course, where the cattle will be sorted, weighed and loaded onto trains. There are saloons, gambling halls and brothels where cowboys can indulge in the vices they've been denied on the trail. There are general stores where they can buy new clothes and equipment. And there are hotels where they can sleep in actual beds and eat actual food prepared by actual cooks. But for all its amenities, Abilene feels more like the end of a dream than the fulfillment of one. The town exists to process cattle and cowboys with mechanical efficiency, extracting maximum profit from both in the shortest possible time. There's no sense of community or permanence, just the raw commercialism of a place that knows its own impermanence. The process of delivering the herd is anticlimactic after weeks of struggle and hardship. The cattle are counted, weighed and transferred to new owners with businesslike efficiency. The trail boss settles accounts with the buyers and calculates pay for the crew. And just like that, the great adventure is over. Your pay, when you finally receive it, comes to about $30 for nearly 3 months of work. It's decent money by the standards of the time, but it doesn't feel like adequate compensation for everything you've endured. The money represents survival rather than prosperity, a reward that allows you to continue existing rather than improving your circumstances. Most of your fellow cowboys head immediately for the saloons and pleasure districts, eager to spend their earnings on the comforts they've been denied. This is the traditional end to a cattle drive, a brief, intense period of indulgence that burns through months of accumulated wages in a matter of days. You understand the impulse. After months of enforced sobriety, terrible food, and celibacy, the temptation to overindulge is almost irresistible. The saloons offer not just alcohol, but also human companionship, music, and the illusion of civilization after weeks in the wilderness. But you also understand that this cycle of deprivation and indulgence is part of what keeps cowboys trapped in their nomadic lifestyle. The money earned through months of hardship gets spent in days of excess, leaving them broke and forced to sign up for another drive. It's a system that benefits saloon keepers and trail bosses more than the cowboys themselves. Instead of following your fellow cowboys into immediate debauchery, you decide to spend your first night in Abilene walking the streets and observing this strange community that exists solely to serve the cattle trade. What you see doesn't particularly encourage you to join the revelry. The main street is a chaos of drunken cowboys, professional gamblers, and various entrepreneurs who've come to Abilene to separate working men from their wages. The noise level is incredible, shouting, laughing, cursing, and the occasional sound of breaking furniture as disagreements escalate into violence. The saloons are packed with cowboys from multiple trail crews, men who've been on the trail for weeks or months, and are now releasing months of pent-up frustration and energy. The atmosphere is simultaneously celebratory and dangerous, with the kind of barely controlled chaos that can explode into serious violence at any moment. You watch Jake, your former crewmate, throw dice with the reckless enthusiasm of a man who's forgotten how hard it was to earn the money he's now betting. Within an hour, he's lost half his trail wages and is well on his way to drinking away the rest. By tomorrow night, he'll be broke and looking for another job. He might be winning now, but by the end of the week, he'll probably be as broke as Jake, because Slim has never learned when to quit while he's ahead. Mexican Pete has disappeared entirely, probably to the Mexican quarter of town, where he can find people who speak his language, and food that reminds him of home. Pete has always been the most practical member of the crew, and you suspect he'll manage his money more carefully than most. Old Tom is holding court at a bar, regaling younger cowboys with stories of trail drives past, accepting drinks from anyone willing to listen to tales of stampedes, river crossings and narrow escapes from various dangers. Tom will probably drink for free all week by trading stories for whiskey, which is probably the smartest financial strategy anyone in the crew has developed. Cookie has vanished as well, probably to find a real kitchen where he can eat food prepared by someone else for a change. After months of cooking over open fires with limited ingredients, Cookie deserves a few good meals, and you hope he finds them. The trail boss is conducting business with cattle buyers and local officials, settling the final details of the delivery and probably negotiating his next contract. Trail bosses who are successful enough to run multiple drives per season can make good money, but they pay for it with a lifestyle that's even more nomadic and rootless than that of regular cowboys. Watching your crew disperse into the chaos of Abilene, you're struck by the temporary nature of the relationships you've formed. These men who've been closer than family for the past 3 months are already becoming strangers again, each pursuing his own version of rest and recreation before moving on to the next job. The bonds forged on the trail are real and strong, but they're also fragile. Without the shared challenges and mutual dependence of the drive, the crew dissolves back into a collection of individuals with different goals and priorities. The intense brotherhood of the trail doesn't survive contact with civilization. This realization is both liberating and melancholy. You're free to make your own choices without considering the needs of the crew, but you're also alone in a way you haven't been for months. The support system that helped you survive the trail has evaporated, leaving you to figure out your next move without the guidance of more experienced men. You find a cheap hotel room and spend your first night indoors in months lying on a real mattress and staring at the ceiling. The bed feels impossibly soft after months of sleeping on the ground, and the silence inside the room is almost oppressive after months of sleeping under the open sky with its constant night sounds. Sleep, when it finally comes, is fitful and interrupted. Your body has adapted to the rhythms of trail life, and the sudden change to civilization creates a kind of psychological jet lag. You wake up several times thinking you hear the sound of stampeding cattle, only to realize it's just the noise of drunken cowboys in the street below. Morning brings the hangover of civilization, not from alcohol, which you've mostly avoided, but from the sudden transition from the simplicity of trail life to the complexity of town living. There are too many choices, too many distractions, too many people, all pursuing their own agendas. You spend the morning exploring Abilene more thoroughly, trying to understand this strange community that's grown up around the cattle trade. What you find is a place that's simultaneously booming and dying, prosperous and desperate, civilized and savage. The legitimate businesses, hotels, restaurants, general stores are thriving thanks to the steady stream of cowboys with money to spend. But these businesses exist in an uneasy partnership with the saloons, gambling halls and brothels that form the real economic heart of the town. Everyone understands that Abilene's prosperity is temporary. The cattle drives will continue only as long as it's profitable to bring Texas cattle north to Kansas railheads. As the railroad extends further south and the open range gets carved up into farms and ranches, the need for long-distance cattle drives will disappear. When that happens, places like Abilene will either reinvent themselves or become ghost towns. The smart money is already looking for ways to transition to more sustainable economic activities, but for now, everyone's focused on extracting maximum profit from the current boom. Buildings are constructed quickly and cheaply because no one expects them to last more than a few years. Businesses focus on immediate profit rather than long-term customer relationships. Social institutions like schools and churches are minimal because most residents don't plan to stay long enough to need them. The result is a community that's both intensely alive and fundamentally hollow. There's enormous energy and activity, but no real sense of purpose beyond making money. It's a place where people come to get rich quick or die trying, not a place where they come to build lasting lives. Walking through Abilene, you begin to understand why so many cowboys get trapped in the cycle of trail drives. The towns that serve the cattle trade offer immediate gratification, but no real opportunities for advancement or stability. A cowboy can spend his wages on a week of pleasure, but he can't use them to build a better life. The skills that make a man a good cowboy, riding, roping, handling cattle, have little value outside the cattle trade. A cowboy who wants to transition to a different line of work essentially has to start over from the beginning, competing with younger men who haven't spent years developing specialized skills that are rapidly becoming obsolete. This economic trap is reinforced by the social dynamics of cowboy culture. The masculine ideals that dominate trail life, independence, toughness, resistance to authority, are exactly the qualities that make it difficult to succeed in more settled occupations that require cooperation, compromise, and acceptance of routine. A man who's proven his courage by facing down stampeding cattle and hostile weather may find it difficult to accept the minor indignities of working for wages in a factory or store. The freedom of the trail, however harsh, can make the constraints of civilized employment feel like surrender. You see this psychological trap in the faces of the older cowboys who frequent Abilene's saloons. These are men who've spent their best years on various trails and now find themselves with few options beyond continuing in a profession that's becoming increasingly dangerous and unrewarding. They're too old to start over in new careers, too set in their ways to adapt to changing times, and too proud to admit that their way of life is becoming obsolete. So they continue signing up for cattle drives, each one a little more desperate than the last, hoping that somehow things will work out despite all evidence to the contrary. The younger cowboys, men your own age, face a different but equally challenging dilemma. They have time to change careers, but they lack the education and connections necessary to succeed in more modern occupations. The trail has taught them valuable lessons about courage and endurance, but it hasn't prepared them for life in an increasingly industrial and urban society. Some of these young men will eventually find ways to transition to other work, becoming ranchers, farmers, or business owners who use their knowledge of cattle and horses in more settled circumstances. But many will simply drift from job to job, never quite finding their place in the changing world. You spend several days in Abilene trying to figure out what comes next. The obvious choice is to sign up for another cattle drive, probably heading back south to Texas to gather another herd for the next season. It's work you now know how to do, and there's always demand for experienced cowboys, but the prospect of repeating the experience you've just completed fills you with a kind of existential dread. The hardships of the trail were bearable when they seemed like temporary obstacles to overcome on the way to something better. The idea of facing those same hardships again and again, with no real prospect of advancement or improvement, seems like a form of voluntary slavery. Yet the alternatives aren't particularly appealing either. You could try to find work in Abilene itself, but the town's economy is entirely dependent on the cattle trade, and most jobs pay less than cowboy work, while offering no more security. You could head further east to look for opportunities in more established communities, but you'd be competing with men who have better educations and more relevant skills. You could try to save enough money to start your own business or buy land, but on cowboy wages that would take years, assuming you could resist the temptations that separate most cowboys from their earnings within days of completing a drive. The more you think about your options, the more you understand why so many men get trapped in the cowboy life. It's not just that the work becomes habitual or that the skills become specialized, it's that the trail offers a kind of freedom that's hard to give up, even when that freedom comes at a terrible price. On the trail, a man answers only to the trail boss and the demands of the job. There are no landlords, no creditors, no social obligations beyond loyalty to the crew. The work is hard and dangerous, but it's also honest and direct. Success and failure are measured in practical terms that everyone can understand. In contrast, civilian life in an increasingly complex society requires navigating systems and institutions that often seem arbitrary and unfair. Success depends not just on hard work and competence, but on understanding unwritten rules, building social connections, and playing political games that cowboys find distasteful. The trail may be harsh, but it's also simple. Civilization offers comfort and security, but it demands compromises that men accustomed to absolute freedom find difficult to accept. This is the fundamental tension that keeps cowboys on the trail long after the rational benefits of the lifestyle have disappeared. After a week in Abilene, you make a decision that surprises even yourself. Instead of signing up for another cattle drive or trying to find work in town, you decide to head east to Kansas City, where you'll try to find opportunities in the growing transportation industry. It's a gamble based more on hope than realistic assessment of your prospects. You have no connections in Kansas City, no relevant experience beyond your time on the trail, and no clear idea of what kind of work you're qualified to do. But you're young enough to take risks, and smart enough to recognize that the cowboy life is a dead end that will only become more obvious with time. Frank, your faithful and cantankerous horse, will have to be sold to finance this transition. It's a decision that weighs on you more heavily than any other aspect of leaving the trail behind. Frank has been your partner, your transportation, and your companion through months of hardship and danger. City life offers no opportunities for a cow pony to use his skills, and the expense of keeping a horse in an urban environment would quickly consume what little money you have saved. Finding a buyer for Frank proves easier than expected. A young cowboy fresh off his first trail drive, flush with his first real wages, and eager to upgrade from the rented horses provided by trail bosses, offers a fair price after watching Frank demonstrate his training and temperament. The new owner is respectful and appreciative, asking detailed questions about Frank's habits and preferences. He clearly intends to take good care of Frank, which makes the sale easier to accept emotionally, if not practically. Saying goodbye to Frank is harder than saying goodbye to your human companions on the trail crew. Frank has been a constant presence during your entire cowboy experience, and selling him feels like closing a chapter of your life permanently. As you watch the young cowboy ride Frank away, probably heading south toward Texas and another season of cattle drives, you feel a mixture of regret and relief. Regret for the end of a partnership that meant more to you than you'd realized. Relief that you're finally breaking the cycle that traps so many men in the gradually dying world of the open range. The train that will take you to Kansas City is a marvel of modern engineering that represents everything the cowboy life is not. It's fast, efficient, comfortable, and runs on a schedule that doesn't depend on weather, terrain, or the temperament of livestock. It's a symbol of the industrial future that's rapidly making the agricultural past obsolete. Sitting in the passenger car, watching the Kansas prairie roll past the window at speeds that would terrify any horse, you reflect on the strange journey that brought you to this point. 6 months ago, you were a naive young man who thought cowboy life would be an adventure. Now you're a slightly less naive young man who understands that adventure and suffering are often the same thing. The skills you've learned on the trail, endurance, self-reliance, the ability to work with difficult people under stressful conditions, will serve you well in whatever comes next. But the romantic illusions about frontier life that motivated your original decision have been permanently burned away by reality. You now understand that the cowboy life, for all its freedom and adventure, is fundamentally a young man's game with no real future. It's a way of life that's already disappearing, made obsolete by the same forces of progress and development that created it in the first place. Grace and the tackle drives that seem so important now are really just a temporary phase in the economic development of the West. Within a few decades, the open range will be carved up into farms and ranches connected by railroads that make long-distance cattle drives unnecessary. The cowboys who don't adapt to this changing reality will find themselves increasingly marginalized, reduced to performing in Wild West shows, or living on the charity of a society that remembers them as colorful relics of a more primitive time. But for now, in this moment of transition between one life and another, you can appreciate the experience for what it was, a brutal education in self-reliance and a harsh introduction to the realities of frontier life. You've learned things about yourself and the world that no classroom could have taught you, even if the tuition was paid in sweat, blood, and constant discomfort. The train pulls into Kansas City as the sun sets, painting the growing cityscape in shades of orange and red that remind you of countless sunsets viewed from horseback. But this sunset marks a beginning rather than just another day survived on the trail. Kansas City is everything that Abilene is not: permanent, diverse, complex, and growing. The streets are paved, the buildings are substantial, and the people you see are engaged in a wide variety of occupations that have nothing to do with cattle or horses. It's intimidating in ways that facing down stampeding cattle never was, because the challenges here are subtle and complex rather than immediate and physical. Success in this environment will require different skills, different strategies, and a different way of thinking about work and life, but it's also exciting in ways that the trail never could be, because it offers the possibility of real growth and advancement. Unlike the cowboy life, which essentially ends where it begins, urban life offers multiple paths to improvement and success. You find a cheap boarding house and spend your first night in Kansas City planning your assault on civilian life. The money from selling Frank, combined with what remains of your trail wages, will last a few weeks if you're careful. That should be enough time to find some kind of work and begin building the foundation for a more sustainable future. It's a challenge that will require all the persistence and adaptability you learned on the trail, applied to an entirely different set of problems. But for the first time since leaving home to join the cattle drive, you feel genuinely optimistic about the future. The trail taught you that you can endure hardship, overcome obstacles, and work effectively with others under difficult conditions. These are valuable skills in any profession, even if they were learned in circumstances you never want to repeat. Looking back on your time as a cowboy, you realize that the most important lesson wasn't about riding horses or handling cattle. It was about understanding your own capabilities and limitations, about learning to distinguish between challenges worth accepting and suffering worth avoiding. The cowboy life offered adventure, but it was adventure without purpose or progression. It demanded courage, but courage in service of goals that ultimately benefited others more than yourself. It provided freedom, but freedom that came at the cost of security, comfort, and the possibility of building something lasting. Now, standing at the threshold of a different kind of life, you understand that real adventure lies not in repeating the same challenges over and over, but in applying the lessons learned from those challenges to create something better. The trail made you tougher, smarter, and more self-reliant. But more importantly, it taught you to recognize the difference between romantic fantasies and harsh realities. That knowledge, painful as it was to acquire, will serve you well in whatever comes next. As you walk the streets of Kansas City, looking for work and opportunity, you carry with you the confidence that comes from having survived something genuinely difficult. You know you can handle physical hardship, work with difficult people, and make decisions under pressure. These are not the only skills required for success in modern society, but they're a solid foundation on which to build others. The boy who left home to become a cowboy is gone, replaced by a young man who understands both the value and the limitations of the frontier experience. You may never ride the trail again, but you'll never forget the lessons it taught you about endurance, adaptation, and the price of freedom. And perhaps most importantly, you'll never again confuse suffering with adventure or mistake hardship for meaning. The West will continue to change, the cattle drives will eventually end, and the cowboy life will become a memory preserved in stories and songs. But the men who lived that life, who survived its challenges and learned its lessons, will carry those experiences forward into whatever comes next. And that perhaps is the real legacy of the cowboy, not the romantic myth of the lone rider on the endless plain, but the practical knowledge that any challenge can be overcome if you're willing to pay the price and smart enough to learn from the experience. The sun sets on your cowboy days, but it rises on possibilities you never could have imagined when you first climbed into Frank's saddle and headed north toward Kansas. But before we close the book on this particular adventure in voluntary suffering, let's take a moment to appreciate some of the finer details of cowboy misery that we haven't fully explored. Because you see, the trail drive itself was just one flavor of cowboy hell. There were so many other ways that this profession could make your life a living nightmare, and it would be a disservice to those poor souls who experience them not to give them their due recognition. Take winter work, for example. If you thought driving cattle through Texas heat was unpleasant, try working a ranch during a Wyoming blizzard. Ranch work doesn't stop just because the temperature drops below freezing, and the wind starts howling like a banshee with a personal grudge against anyone foolish enough to be outside. Cattle don't magically take care of themselves just because there's 3 feet of snow on the ground. They still need to be fed, watered, and checked for injuries. Horses still need to be cared for, equipment still needs to be maintained, and all of this work has to be done while wearing every piece of clothing you own, and still feeling like your extremities are going to fall off from frostbite. Winter feeding involves breaking through ice to get to water sources, hauling hay through snowdrifts that can swallow a horse, and trying to keep cattle from wandering off and freezing to death in places where you can't find them until spring. It's like summer ranch work, except everything takes 3 times as long, hurts twice as much, and carries the added risk of dying from exposure. The clothing technology of the era wasn't exactly designed for Arctic conditions either. Your winter outfit consists of layers of wool, leather, and whatever else you can find, all of which becomes wet, heavy, and useless the moment you start sweating from physical exertion. Staying warm requires constant movement, but moving around generates heat that melts snow, which then freezes into ice, creating a feedback loop of misery that continues until spring. Sleep during winter ranch work is particularly challenging. The bunkhouse, if you're lucky enough to have one, is usually a drafty wooden structure with minimal insulation and a wood stove that provides heat to about a 3-foot radius around itself. Everyone sleeps as close to the stove as possible, which means the lucky few get roasted while everyone else slowly freezes. The unlucky souls who end up sleeping near the walls wake up with frost on their blankets and icicles in their mustaches. Getting up in the morning requires an act of will that would impress philosophers and saints, because leaving the warmth of your bedroll means stepping into an environment that actively wants to kill you. Using the outhouse when it's 20 below zero is an experience that builds character in ways that most people never want their character built. The seat is cold enough to take skin off unprotected flesh, and the whole experience has to be completed as quickly as possible to avoid actual injury from exposure. Some cowboys simply gave up on outdoor facilities during the worst weather and used chamber pots or other indoor arrangements, which created its own set of hygiene challenges in cramped living quarters. The choice between freezing your backside off and living with the aromatic consequences of indoor waste management is exactly the kind of lose-lose decision that defined cowboy life. Winter also brought the constant threat of being trapped by weather in places where help couldn't reach you. Cowboys working remote sections of large ranches could be cut off from civilization for weeks or months at a time, depending entirely on whatever supplies they had managed to stockpile before the really bad weather hit. Running out of food during a winter isolation was a death sentence that played out slowly over weeks of increasing desperation. Running out of fuel for heating meant freezing to death in a matter of hours. Running out of feed for the horses meant losing your only means of transportation and communication with the outside world. These scenarios weren't theoretical risks. They were regular occurrences that killed cowboys every winter. The newspapers of the era are full of stories about cowboys found dead in their cabins come spring, usually with evidence that they had survived for weeks or months before finally succumbing to starvation, cold, or some combination of both. But winter work was just one seasonal variation on the theme of cowboy suffering. Spring brought its own special challenges, starting with the delightful process known as roundup. Roundup involved gathering all the cattle from their winter ranges, sorting them by ownership, branding the new calves, and generally accounting for what had survived the winter and what had become dinner for wolves. It was like the world's most complicated and dangerous game of inventory management, except the inventory consisted of half-wild animals that didn't want to be counted. Cattle that had spent the winter ranging freely across thousands of acres of open prairie developed an independence and wildness that made them exponentially more difficult to handle than trail-broken animals. They were suspicious of humans, quick to stampede, and perfectly willing to fight rather than submit to being herded. The work involved long days in the saddle, tracking down scattered animals across terrain that could hide entire herds in its folds and valleys. Cowboys worked in teams, sweeping across vast areas and driving everything they found towards central gathering points where the real work could begin. Sorting cattle required the ability to read brands quickly and accurately while the animals were moving, often at considerable speed and in clouds of dust that made visibility poor. Making a mistake meant losing valuable animals or accidentally stealing someone else's stock, both of which could lead to conflicts that might be settled with bullets rather than lawyers. Branding new calves was perhaps the most unpleasant part of roundup, combining the stress of handling frightened animals with the smell of burning hair and flesh. The calves had to be roped, thrown, and held down while red-hot irons were applied to their hides. The animals' distress was obvious and disturbing, even to men who had learned to compartmentalize their feelings about animal welfare. The work was dangerous as well as unpleasant. Angry mother cows would charge anyone who approached their calves, and a protective bovine mother weighs enough to crush a horse and rider with ease. Cowboys were regularly injured by kicks, horn wounds, and simple trampling during the chaos of roundup operations. Rope work during roundup required skills that took years to develop and could be lethal if performed incorrectly. A missed loop could mean losing valuable cattle. A poorly tied knot could mean getting dragged to death behind a panicked animal. A moment of inattention could mean getting entangled in rope and suffering injuries that ranged from simple rope burns to amputated fingers. The social dynamics of roundup were complicated by the fact that multiple ranches often worked together, combining their crews for efficiency, but also creating opportunities for conflict between men who worked for competing interests. Disputes over ownership of unbranded cattle, questions about property boundaries, and simple personality conflicts between cowboys from different outfits could escalate into serious problems. These conflicts were exacerbated by the fact that roundup brought together cowboys who had been isolated on remote ranches all winter, men who had been deprived of human companionship for months and weren't necessarily at their social best. The combination of pent-up energy, competitive instincts, and the stress of difficult work created an atmosphere where violence was always just below the surface. After the cattle were gathered and sorted, they often had to be moved to different ranges or driven to market, which brought us back to the trail driving experience we've already explored in loving detail. But even cowboys who didn't participate in long-distance drives faced the challenge of moving cattle shorter distances under conditions that were often just as difficult. Local drives might involve moving herds through settled country, where farmers had legitimate complaints about crop damage, through terrain that was too rough for wagon access, or across rivers that were swollen with spring runoff. These shorter drives lacked the epic scope of the great trail drives, but they offered most of the same opportunities for misery and death. Summer ranch work, when it wasn't focused on trail driving, involved the constant maintenance tasks that kept a cattle operation running. Fences had to be built and repaired, water sources had to be developed and maintained, hay had to be cut and stored for winter feeding, and the general infrastructure of ranch life had to be maintained against the constant assault of weather, wildlife, and time. Fence building in particular was a job that combined back-breaking physical labor with mind-numbing repetition. Posts had to be cut, hauled to remote locations, and set in holes that were dug by hand in ground that was often rocky, root-filled, or simply too hard to penetrate without heroic effort. Wire had to be strung tight enough to contain cattle, but not so tight that it snapped in cold weather. The work was typically done in teams, with one man digging holes while another cut posts, hauled materials, or performed the dozens of other tasks required to build miles of fence across country that seemed specifically designed to make fence building as difficult as possible. The pay was minimal, the work was endless, and the results were constantly being destroyed by weather, animals, or simple entropy. Water development was another crucial but thankless task that involved digging wells, building dams, cleaning springs, and maintaining the various systems that kept cattle supplied with the water they needed to survive. This work often required spending long hours in muddy, mosquito-infested conditions, wrestling with equipment that broke constantly, and materials that seemed to have been designed by people who had never actually tried to build anything. Hay cutting and storage was seasonal work that had to be completed during the brief window when the grass was mature enough to cut, but not so mature that it had lost its nutritional value. The work involved long days with scythes and hay forks, loading wagons by hand, and storing the hay in barns or stacks that would protect it from weather until it was needed for winter feeding. The physical demands of hay work were enormous, requiring the kind of sustained manual labor that left men exhausted and sore for days afterward. The schedule was determined by weather rather than human convenience, which meant working from dawn to dark when conditions were good and accepting the fact that rain could destroy weeks of work in a matter of hours. And then there were the various emergencies and disasters that punctuated ranch life with irregular but inevitable frequency. Cattle got stuck in mud, fell through ice, wandered into box canyons, or simply disappeared into terrain where they couldn't be found without extensive searching. Each of these situations required immediate attention and often involved risking human life to save animal property. Prairie fires were a constant threat that could destroy months of work in a matter of hours. Fighting fires required every available man and often involved techniques that were barely more sophisticated than beating the flames with wet blankets. Men were regularly burned, overcome by smoke, or simply exhausted to the point of collapse during firefighting operations. Severe weather brought its own set of emergencies. Tornadoes could scatter cattle across multiple counties and destroy buildings that represented years of investment. Hailstorms could kill livestock and destroy crops. Flash floods could wash away entire herds and leave cowboys stranded in remote locations with no way to call for help. This often meant destroying apparently healthy animals that might be carrying disease, a financially devastating decision that had to be made quickly, and with incomplete information. Cowboys found themselves playing amateur veterinarian in situations where mistakes could mean the difference between financial survival and ruin. The isolation of ranch life created its own set of psychological challenges that affected cowboys differently than the intense but temporary hardships of trail driving. While trail crews provided companionship and social interaction, ranch work often involved long periods of solitude that could drive men to distraction or worse. Cowboys assigned to line camps or remote stations might go weeks without seeing another human being, alone with their thoughts and whatever books or diversions they could carry with them. The silence and emptiness of the prairie, so romantic in small doses, became oppressive when experienced for extended periods without relief. Some men thrived in this isolation, finding peace and contentment in the simplicity of life reduced to its most basic elements. But others found the loneliness unbearable, leading to depression, alcoholism, or the kind of eccentric behavior that came from spending too much time talking to horses and cattle instead of people. The lack of medical care in remote locations meant that minor injuries could become major problems, and major injuries could be fatal. A broken bone, a serious cut, or a severe illness could mean death simply because there was no way to get proper treatment in time. Cowboys learned basic first aid out of necessity, but their medical knowledge was limited and often more dangerous than helpful. Mental health issues were neither understood nor treated in any systematic way. Cowboys who suffered from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress were expected to tough it out or find other work. The culture of masculine stoicism that defined cowboy life made it almost impossible for men to seek help for psychological problems, even when such help might have been available. The economic realities of cowboy life created long-term problems that became more apparent as men aged. The physical demands of the work meant that most cowboys couldn't continue in active ranch work much past their 40th birthday. Bodies that had been battered by years of hard labor, injuries, and exposure simply couldn't maintain the level of performance that the job required. But cowboys who had spent their prime years developing specialized skills found it difficult to transition to other occupations. The economic opportunities in frontier communities were limited, and most required either capital investment or educational qualifications that cowboys typically lacked. The result was a growing population of broken-down cowboys who had outlived their usefulness but had no realistic alternatives for supporting themselves. Some found work as town marshals or security guards, using their reputation for toughness to maintain order in communities that couldn't afford professional law enforcement. Others became handymen, laborers, or simply drifters who moved from place to place looking for temporary work. The lucky few managed to save enough money to buy small ranches or businesses of their own, but this required a level of financial discipline that was rare among men who had learned to live for the moment and spend money as quickly as they earned it. Most cowboys never accumulated enough capital to become independent operators. Retirement as a concept simply didn't exist for most cowboys. They worked until they couldn't work anymore, then relied on charity, family, or simple luck to survive their declining years. The romantic image of the independent cowboy was undermined by the reality that most cowboys ended their careers as dependent upon others as they had been when they started. The social status of cowboys was also more complicated than popular culture suggests. While cowboys were often romanticized in popular literature and eventually in movies, their actual status in frontier society was relatively low. They were seen as useful but temporary employees, men who performed necessary but unglamorous work under the supervision of more respectable business owners. Cowboys were often viewed with suspicion by settled communities, seen as rootless drifters who brought trouble with them wherever they went. The violence and disorder that sometimes accompanied cattle drives gave cowboys a reputation for lawlessness that made them unwelcome in many towns except when their services were specifically needed. The relationship between cowboys and the businessmen who employed them was essentially colonial, with the cowboys providing labor and the owners capturing most of the profits. Cowboys rarely had any ownership stake in the enterprises they served, and their interests were often directly opposed to those of their employers. This economic relationship was complicated by the personal bonds that often developed between cowboys and ranch owners, relationships that could blur the lines between employer and employee in ways that both helped and hindered the cowboy's interests. A cowboy who was trusted and respected by his boss might receive better treatment and more opportunities, but this dependency also made him vulnerable to exploitation. The racial dynamics of cowboy life were also more complex than popular culture typically acknowledges. While the iconic image of the cowboy is usually white, the actual workforce included significant numbers of Mexican vaqueros, African-American cowboys, and Native Americans who had learned European-style ranching techniques. These non-white cowboys often faced additional challenges and discrimination that made an already difficult profession even harder. They might be paid less than white cowboys for the same work, excluded from certain jobs or opportunities, or simply treated with less respect and consideration by employers and fellow workers. Mexican vaqueros brought centuries of experience and sophisticated techniques to American ranching, but their expertise was often undervalued and their contributions minimized. African-American cowboys, many of them former slaves, found that the frontier offered more opportunities than most other regions, but they still faced significant prejudice and limited advancement prospects. Native American cowboys occupied a particularly complex position, working within an economic system that was actively destroying their traditional way of life while offering them one of the few opportunities for employment in the new economy. Their knowledge of local terrain and wildlife made them valuable employees, but their cultural background often put them in conflict with the values and assumptions of white-dominated ranching operations. The integration of these diverse groups into cowboy crews created its own set of social dynamics and tensions. While the shared hardships of cowboy life sometimes broke down racial barriers, they also created opportunities for exploitation and conflict based on cultural differences and competing survival strategies. Language barriers complicated communication and cooperation among ethnically diverse crews. Different cultural attitudes toward authority, property, and social relationships created misunderstandings that could escalate into serious conflicts. Competition for jobs and advancement opportunities sometimes intensified racial tensions rather than reducing them. Yet the cowboy life also created opportunities for cross-cultural exchange and cooperation that were rare in other contexts. Men who might never have interacted in more settled communities found themselves depending on each other for survival in situations where competence mattered more than background. The technical knowledge that different groups brought to ranching was gradually synthesized into the hybrid techniques that defined American cowboy culture. Mexican saddle designs, Native American tracking skills, and African American horse training methods all contributed to the development of a distinctly American approach to cattle ranching. This cultural synthesis was never complete or entirely harmonious, but it represented a kind of practical multiculturalism that was forced by the necessities of frontier life. Cowboys learned from each other because their survival depended on acquiring and sharing useful knowledge, regardless of its cultural origins. The environmental impact of large-scale cattle ranching was another aspect of cowboy life that became more apparent over time. The open-range system that made early ranching profitable was ultimately unsustainable, leading to overgrazing, soil erosion, and the destruction of native plant and animal communities. Cowboys were the agents of this environmental transformation, but they were rarely in positions to influence the policies that drove it. The pressure to maximize short-term profits led to stocking rates that exceeded the land's carrying capacity, creating ecological damage that became apparent only after it was too late to prevent. The competition for grazing rights led to conflicts between different ranching operations, between ranchers and farmers, and between ranchers and Native American tribes who had traditional claims to the same territories. Cowboys found themselves on the front lines of these conflicts, often fighting for causes they didn't fully understand or believe in. The gradual fencing of the open range represented the end of the classical cowboy era, but it also created new forms of work and new challenges for the men who had learned their skills in the open range system. Fence riding, ranch maintenance, and the care of cattle in confined spaces required different techniques and offered different opportunities than the free-range practices of the earlier period. Some cowboys adapted successfully to these changes, developing new skills and finding new roles within the evolving ranching industry. Others found themselves displaced by technological changes and new management practices that reduced the demand for traditional cowboy skills. The mechanization of agriculture and transportation gradually reduced the need for horseback workers in many ranching operations. Trucks, tractors, and other machinery could perform many tasks more efficiently than men on horseback, leading to a steady decline in employment opportunities for traditional cowboys. But perhaps the most significant factor in the decline of cowboy culture was simply the success of the broader settlement movement. As the frontier filled up with farmers, towns, and other forms of development, the open spaces that had made cowboy life possible gradually disappeared. The cowboy era was essentially a transition period between the Native American use of the Great Plains and their development for intensive agriculture. Cowboys were the agents of this transition, but they were also its victims, displaced by the very progress they had helped to create. Looking back on the cowboy experience from the perspective of Kansas City, with its paved streets and electric lights and regular train service, you can see how quickly that way of life was disappearing. The skills you learned on the trail were already becoming obsolete, relevant mainly for nostalgic entertainment rather than practical employment. The men who continued in cowboy work would find themselves increasingly marginalized, performing for tourists and movie cameras rather than serving essential economic functions. The real cowboys would be replaced by actors and performers who could provide the romanticized version of cowboy life that people preferred to remember. But for the men who actually lived it, who endured the hardships and learned the lessons and paid the prices, the cowboy experience remained a defining part of their identity regardless of what came afterward. The trail had changed them in ways that couldn't be undone, teaching them things about themselves and the world that would influence every decision they made for the rest of their lives. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of the cowboy era, not the romantic mythology that grew up around it, but the practical knowledge that ordinary men could endure extraordinary hardships and emerge stronger for the experience. It was a brutal education, but it was an education nonetheless, one that prepared its graduates for whatever challenges the rapidly changing world might throw at them. So there you have it, the complete and unglamorous truth about why it sucked to be a cowboy in the Wild West. Not the romantic adventure of Hollywood movies, but a grinding test of endurance that broke more men than it made, a profession that offered freedom at the cost of everything else, adventure at the price of comfort, and experience that came with a bill that many men spent their entire lives trying to pay. The next time you see a Western movie with its heroic cowboys riding into glorious sunsets, remember the reality: men like you, tired and dirty and sore, counting the days until they could quit this job and find something, anything that didn't involve convincing stubborn animals to walk hundreds of miles through hostile country while eating beans and sleeping on rocks. The West was won, all right, but it wasn't won by heroes in white hats. It was won by ordinary men doing an extraordinary job under conditions that would make modern workers file lawsuits and demand hazard pay, and most of them, if they were honest, would tell you it sucked more often than it didn't. Sweet dreams, and maybe tonight you'll appreciate your soft bed and indoor plumbing just a little bit more.